Disclaimer, not disclaimer. This teaching is not intended to replace studying the Torah on Shabbat. Rather, it is an extension of Torah study to learn from the sins of our forebears in the ancient past so we will understand the Torah's practical application in our own lives today. We will also regain our national identity, which is so greatly missing among us. Our true identity is not the nation of our biological birth, but with biblical Israel. And the patriotism for biblical Israel, which we so badly need, can be gained by identifying with the people and history of those ancient times. Always study the Torah of Yahweh, which is His instructions, teachings, and His law, rolled into one word, Torah. Not only on Shabbat, but every day we should meditate on His Torah, His law. Psalms 119, 105. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. Deuteronomy 5:33. You shall walk in all the ways which Yahweh your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess. Psalms 1:1 and 1:2. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand on the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in Yahweh's law, His Torah. On His law, His Torah, he meditates day and night. Psalms 119, 174. I have longed for your salvation, Yahweh. Your law, your Torah, is my delight. All right, Father, I thank you for this teaching, and I find it amazing, and I want to speak only your words, Father. I want to speak only what you want and what your understanding is, and not what mine is. So, Father, I pray that your words will flourish and mine will die and blow away. And I ask that our minds, our eyes, our ears, our hearts will be opened to understand what you have said. In Yeshua's name, amen. You know, you can see up there on the screen that I've got the script, basically. I am so amazed by this that I want to just do an off-script introduction, because this is Judges chapter 16, and it is complicated. There are two sets of prophecies in this chapter, and the first set of prophecies is simply the first 3 verses, and there is so much information in those prophecies, and they're important prophecies. These prophecies are important enough that had the Jews, before Yeshua came, had they understood what Samson was revealing, I guess maybe that's why Isaiah said, you know, Yahweh is going to blind their eyes so that they don't understand it. But when you know what it is that Yahweh has been telling us for all these 3,100 years since the time of Samson, and what he was telling us even from the time of the forefathers and Joseph, which was about 4,000 years ago, then you'll understand how long it has been that Yahweh is telling us exactly what He's going to do. And, you know, not so much in this teaching, but in the next week's teaching, God willing, I'm going to share with you how both of these sets of prophecies come to us even in the end of days. And so I want to just start reading here now of the transcript, which says the story of Samson is entirely prophetic. And it is. It is entirely prophetic. The story of Samson is not about the weaknesses of the flesh, of his flesh, of our flesh, from which we fall into sin. That's not what it's about. Rather, it is the story of the sorry spiritual state of Israel, which will now require detailed prophecies about Israel's Messiah yet to come, details that were not given heretofore in the lives of the forefathers and Joseph and Moses. The preceding chapters were parallels of Samson's life, paralleling the coming Messiah, Yeshua. This last chapter, chapter 16 of his account, will see a switch in Samson's character, as he will now be a parallel of the world from verses 1 to 3. And actually, it's mostly in verse 1 because he switches back actually to early in verse 2. He is, he becomes back to paralleling the Messiah. Now, before I proceed, and I've already given you my off-the-cuff, extemporaneous introduction, be warned that you really have to pay attention, as this chapter's prophecies are among the most complex I've encountered in all of Scripture. If it wasn't for the Lord, if it wasn't for Yahweh, I would not have this, because this is actually, I've had to really wrap my mind around it. It's been difficult to wrap my mind around it. So I know that just hearing it, you're gonna have to pay attention. There is a lot of meat in just the first 3 verses, which is why I can only teach these verses this week. Samson's role in Judges 16, 1 through 3 begins with him now paralleling the world, while a whore found in the world parallels Israel in 2 different ways. So I'm telling you this up front so you will know to really pay attention, because you likely have not heard this before. I know I've never heard this before. And as I said, it gets complicated, which requires lots of explanation. So I'm going to make it easy. I'm going to go off script here again. The 2 ways that the 2 whores of chapter of 16:1 is first the whole house of Israel and then the northern house of Israel. There's stuff that applies to both of them, and I'm going to show you the scriptures that applies to both the whole house of Israel, and then later on, because remember, Samson is prophesying about Israel. And so first, the first whore of Judges chapter 16 parallels Israel's spiritual state at the time of Samson, for which Yeshua will later have to come and die to restore what he began from the foundation of the world, and then which he formalized at Mount Sinai. So at this time in Samson's life, this whore in Judges chapter 16, this one that's in the world, that is Israel during the time of Samson. And so Again, this whore prophesies of two different stages of Israel's idolatry. First, during Samson's lifetime, as I just said, and second, this same whore prophesies of the northern house of Israel, which will come in about 400 years from Samson's lifetime. So these are two different stages, two different ways that this prophecy is given, which has to do with, you know, the one whore that's in Judges chapter 16, 1. And I said to you, and I'm going to repeat this, you're going to hear me repeat these things because it's going to be necessary to understand. Repetition is the way that we learn. And so I'm going to you'll hear me say some things later on that I've already said. And that means that I'm just trying to drive home the impact of this. Samson's actions with this whore that he found in Gaza parallels the world interacting with Israel in his day. So let's read Judges chapter 16, verse 1. Samson went to Gaza and saw there a prostitute and went into her. Now, it's not here in this teaching, but that word there is zana. It is, she is not a kodesh. She's not a temple whore. She's just quite simply a prostitute, just a street whore. This is what Yahweh is saying about Israel during Samson's lifetime. And notice that this whore is not given a name. That's because it is to be understood that her name is Israel. So this prophecy has a double meaning. The first meaning is that Israel, which is the whole house of Israel, all 13 tribes, i.e., the entire nation, was a whore during Samson's lifetime. She was in the world and she was of the world already at that time. This is what Yahweh's message to Israel with Samson's action means. This is the simple meaning of Samson, the world going into her, Israel. In the physical, he saw the prostitute, he had sex with her. Period. Simple as that. No relationship, no conversation, no interactions, except for the fornication. Now, I wrote here that we needn't discuss Samson's sin because, his sin reflects the nature of the world under Satan. In this, he symbolizes the world and what the world does to Israel, because Israel is also the world at this point. But be it known that Israel in the world is persecuted. People might not even know that, they're persecuting Israel, but they're punishing Israel in the world, and that's what's actually happening here in verse 1. And that's the point. Israel was a whore who bedded down with every other god among the nations that came to her. Ezekiel, several hundred years later, described her in absolute pornographic terms. It is simple enough that Israel was a whore during the time of Samson. But now we can also move forward in time to another whore, because there will actually be two whores in this chapter, but today we will only learn about one in this teaching, and we'll leave the other for next week. However, here is what Yahweh said through Ezekiel about the other prophetic aspect of the whole house of Israel as a whore and as the northern house. In Ezekiel 23, the two houses are mixed together. Now, what I'm teaching is what is said about the whole house of Israel in Samson's time and later to come the northern house. And then next week we're going to tie in the rest, the other whore. But because this is Ezekiel and he's talking about both here, this is kind of what makes it complicated. So the secondary meaning of this prophecy in Judges 16:1 has to do with the northern house of Israel after the split in David's kingdom, and I have tried to keep it simple to make it only pertain to these two aspects. One, the whole house of Israel in Samson's time, and then the northern house. Because in Ezekiel 23, verse 44, it says, they, that's the world and Samson, in terms of his prophecy, went into her, the world and Samson, they went into the whole house of Israel, as they, men of the world, go into a prostitute. You know, the woman was from Gaza, she was a prostitute. That's exactly what Ezekiel 23:44 says. They go into her, which is the whole house of Israel, as men of the world go into a prostitute. So they went into Oholah and to Aholibah, the lewd women, Yahweh calls them. Aholah and Aholibah are Yahweh's names of condemnation for the northern and southern kingdoms. And I might get somewhere to where it says this, but I'll just put it in here. Because as it says in Ezekiel 23:4, as for their names, Samaria is Aholah, and Jerusalem is Aholibah. And the reason that he says further on in this chapter in Ezekiel 23 that Samaria is the elder and Jerusalem is the younger sister is because we've now been through the book of Judges, and we now know that the tabernacle sat in the territory of Ephraim, which is Samaria. So he's referencing them in the order in which they have had authority over all Israel. In Samaria, at the tabernacle in Shiloh, Aholah had authority before Jerusalem, Aholibah. By the time Ezekiel wrote about Israel as a whore, the nation was already split into the two sisters. But an enemy, Assyria, was trying to conquer both territories, meaning Assyria wanted to conquer both houses, i.e., they wanted all of Israel. But this also means that Ezekiel had to now deal with the two sisters that came from the split in the kingdom. That's why Ezekiel 23 is written this way. Nonetheless, each whorish sister in the family of God, his nation, were whores together and separately. Thus, his whole house was a whore from the beginning, described by Samson's Judges 16:1 prophecy, and then later condemned as such by Ezekiel. So how do we know that the meaning of the two sisters is that they are the whole house of Israel together, since at the time of Ezekiel, one was the already exiled northern house, and the other was the already exiled southern house. Well, we know this because of the way Ezekiel defined them in verse 23:3. They, the two sisters, played the prostitute in Egypt. They played the prostitute in their youth. Their breasts were fondled there, and their youthful nipples were caressed there. So were the 13 tribes split into two kingdoms in Egypt? No. Yet Yahweh said the sisters were extant even in Egypt. Their national split went all the way back to the beginning, although it didn't happen until centuries later. Now, could this be a reference to a later time in Israel's history when, under Solomon, they began to have relationship with Egypt, which Yahweh told them not to have? No. And why is that? It is because the only time that Israel was a virgin, a youth, was in Egypt before the Exodus. And that was the time before the national marriage to Yahweh at Mount Sinai. Ezekiel 23:4. Their names were Aholah the elder and Aholibah her sister. I've already explained why Aholah, Samaria, is the elder, and Aholibah, Jerusalem, is her younger sister. They became mine, and they bore sons and daughters. Let's stop there. In other words, the sons and daughters of the people were the king's property. Now here's a little side lesson, because we need to understand this about what it means to be part of a king's empire. Yahweh, Yeshua, owned the sons and daughters of the people. That's why the sons and daughters of the people were liable for everything that was agreed to at Mount Sinai. That's one of the reasons. So yes, kings own their people, which is why kings must provide for their people. Just kings are not to enslave their people, but the king's job is to take care of them, like Yahweh takes care of, provides for, and protects his people. That is the role of a king. So when he says, they became mine, and they bore sons and daughters, that means they and their progeny are owned by him. So after the kingdom split, Samaria became the northern house of Israel, Aholah, and Jerusalem became the southern house of Judah, Aholibah. The prophecy in Samuel of Israel as the whole house of Israel, already being a whore in his time, becomes also a prophecy of the northern kingdom that would come about 400 years later. And it is this whore which is also addressed in Judges 16:1 and in the book of Ezekiel in chapter 23. The other whore that we're not talking about this week will be addressed in Judges 16:4-22. So right now we're going to see how Ezekiel addresses what became of Aholah, aka the northern house of Israel, because Ezekiel talks about them together and what they did, as a whole house of Israel, but now he's going to address them separately. And this is where Judges 16 verse 1 now becomes a dual prophecy. It has double meaning. It has double entendre there. Not only for that house of Israel whore in Samson's time, or Aholah, in that was before Ezekiel's time, but now also for us at the end of days. And I may get to that today. If not, it'll be next week. Ezekiel 23:5. Aholah, Samaria, or the northern house, played the prostitute when she was mine. She doted on her lovers, on the Assyrians, her neighbors, who were clothed with blue, governors and rulers, all of them desirable young men, horsemen riding on horses. She gave herself as a prostitute to them, all of them the choicest men of Assyria. She defiled herself with the idols of whoever she lusted after. She hasn't left her prostitution since leaving Egypt. By the way, that statement right there goes back to the golden calf. For in her youth they, the Egyptians, lay with her, meaning the tribes which would be later in the north partook of Egypt's idolatry while they were in Egypt. They caressed her youthful nipples and they poured out their prostitution on her. The Egyptian idolatry involved fornication, ritual sex in Egyptian temples. So the Egyptians poured out their prostitution on Israel while she was in Egypt. Actually, it was on all 13 tribes, as well as those ones that are in exile now from the northern kingdom. Therefore I delivered her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, on whom she doted. Egyptians, Assyrians, there's no difference spiritually speaking. But in other words, Yahweh had had enough. By the time the northern house had existed for a couple hundred years, he was just fed up. The whoredom of Israel, the whole house of Israel, was centuries long from the time of Egypt to the time when the Assyrian Empire arose. And don't think that it was just the northern kingdom that was being whorish. We're going to find out that that's not the case. The southern house would like for you to think that they have never sinned, and I have read articles where they say we're not being punished for our sins because we have not sinned. I've read those articles written by people in Israel. That's not the case. They did. It was this empire, the Assyrian Empire, which Yahweh raised up to take his whoring, adulterous wife away after he divorced her. Jeremiah 3:6 says, Moreover, Yahweh said to me in the days of Josiah the king, Have you seen that which backsliding Israel has done? She has gone up on every high mountain and under every green tree and has played the prostitute there. I said, after she had done all these things, she will return to me. But she didn't return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. I saw when, for this very cause, that backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away, or, in other words, taken into exile by the Assyrians, and gave her a certificate of divorce. Ezekiel further said, in verse 10, These Assyrians uncovered her nakedness. That's a euphemism for exposing the body and for sexual relations, which in this case was the equivalent of adultery, idolatry also, against Yahweh her husband. Ezekiel says they took her sons and her daughters and they killed her. That's the northern house of Israel. They killed the northern house of Israel with the sword. So the northern house of Israel was divorced from Yahweh, and as the Assyrians took them into exile, they were slaughtered. You know, the Assyrians were brutal to their captives. But hey, she was already divorced. So Yahweh could not and did not intervene. She was no longer his responsibility, see? But since he did not do that to the southern house, he had the responsibility of bringing those four tribes back. Ezekiel 23:10 continues, "She became a byword among the women, for they executed judgments on her." And don't we know how the world judges those who call themselves by Yahweh's name and then profane his name when we sin against him? And don't we know that the world's condemnation is harsher than Yahweh's? He always gives us mercy when we ask, but the world does not. Now, under Jeroboam, the first king of the northern house of Israel, the northern kingdom, to whom Yahweh gave 10 parts of the kingdom. That's why, from that is why we have this 10 tribes, thing that we say. You can find all this in 1 Kings 11:31 to 43. Aholah continued as a whore. Ezekiel 23:10 shows us how well that worked out for them. The Assyrians were brutal to the northern house whore. Didn't work out too good for them to fall in love with the Assyrians and then marry that brutal husband. Here is what Jeroboam from 1 Kings 11:31 to 43 did to Yahweh. Here's what Jeroboam did to Yahweh, which was prophesied by Samson's going into the whore. What happened when Samson went into the whore? He just went in, he had sex, he left. Right? No relationship, no conversation, no interactions. Jeroboam cut that off completely from the start. Samson's prophecy in Judges 16:1 came to pass with Jeroboam. He and the kings who succeeded him put their trust in other gods, and the empire that arose, Assyria, who then attacked them. And you can read all of that in the history, in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, and you can read all about that, how they courted Assyria to come and help them attack Judah and blah blah blah. There's a lot of information there that I can't go into for lack of time. But not all hope was lost for the northern house. The next 2 verses describe Samson paralleling Yeshua. Again, in the first verse, he parallels the world going into Yahweh's whore. Then in verse 2, he's back to paralleling Yeshua. I'm going to show you this. And the salvation that Yeshua will bring to the northern house. Now, why does this prophecy switch back to salvation for the northern kingdom so quickly? It's like, you read that first verse, you can completely miss this. I would have missed it if Yahweh hadn't shown it to me. It is because one of the meanings of verse 1's prophecy is that Israel, which is the whole house of Israel and the northern house, were already in captivity in Gaza, in the Philistine territory, and even in their own territory being ruled by the Philistines, which represent the world. And they needed the salvation which Yeshua would bring to them in the future. Israel had already been cast out of the kingdom during Samson's time. People don't get that, and they didn't get it yet. He had already made up his mind what was going transpire. That's what Samson's prophecy is about in Judges chapter 16. The Philistine territory is a type and shadow of the world at large, and that is where Samson found his whore. She was in the world, and Samson was the world going into her for fornication and idolatry. Now, I know this is confusing because of the double meaning. You know, some prophecies do have double meanings. And often I refer to Isaiah 61 as a good example of this because that chapter speaks of the city as a city, but also as the people. And as such, the prophetic understanding of that chapter can be taken both ways in many of the scriptures. You know, like, okay, does Isaiah mean this for the city, or does he mean this for the people? And you can take it both ways because it applies both ways. And so we have this same situation in Judges 16:1, in which it speaks of the whole house of Israel at the time of Samson, and at the same time his other meaning has to do with the other house of Israel, later known as the northern house, or the 10 tribes, the house of Joseph and the house of Ephraim. So verse 1 speaks to us of when the whole house of Israel was in the land. They're still living in the land, and the Philistines are their authority over them. And at the same time, the house that calls itself after the name of the land, Israel, the northern house of Israel. And let me say that the northern house of Israel is still a whore to this day. From the time of Jeroboam and his successors through the exile of the Assyrians all the way to today, the northern house is a whore that Samson was prophesying about. Just look at Christianity, which is where many from the Israelite tribes are trapped. Christianity's false doctrines have led to the religious practices of the demons being held right in the church. Christmas and Easter, Baal and Asherah or Ishtar, the 2 demon deities worshipped by the northern house while they were still in the land, are those which they continued to worship in exile. And off script here, I'm not sticking with it too well anyway. Jeremiah 10 spoke to the Jews and said, don't be putting up trees and decorating them and, sticking them to the base of something so they can stand up because you brought them in the house. Don't do that. Where did they learn to do that? From the northern house. Who's doing that today? The northern house. Christianity. Then the northern house brought these and other demonic religious practices into what began in purity in the 1st century AD. But by the end of the 4th century AD, the pure faith of Yeshua from that 1st century was hijacked again, and the religious practices of Christmas and Easter, Baal and Asherah or Ishtar, began again, along with a host of other religious practices that this teaching just does not have time to address. Christmas and Easter are the most well known, which is why I mention them. But now, in Judges 16:2 and 3 comes the prophecy of the northern house of Israel, whore's salvation. Hosea had told the northern house they must stop their idolatry or Yahweh would exile them into the world where they would be lo ami, not my people, and I will not be your God. Hosea 1:9. And he said he would put up a hedge in their path, so there would be no return to Israel in Hosea 2, verses 1 to 7. At least, not a return to Israel as she was during her whoredom days. Now, there would be a return, but only after Yeshua came to restore Israel and save the world. Hosea 2:1 says, "Say to your brothers, my people, and to your sisters, my loved one, contend with your mother." Who is this people's mother? Israel. And who is the sister? The southern house of Judah. Hosea speaks to the northern house of Israel here, and he says, "Contend, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband." In fact, he's already divorced her, but he has not yet sent her out of the land. "And let her put away her prostitution from her face, and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, and make her bare as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and kill her with thirst." That describes the Assyrians taking the northern house captive into exile. Hosea 2:4. "Indeed, on her children I will have no mercy, for they are children of unfaithfulness." In other words, their children are bastards. "For their mother has played the prostitute. She who conceived them has done shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink." You know, when I read this, it just ticks me off, because who had been providing for them all along? It was Yahweh. These are people living in the land which Yahweh promised them, saying He does not take care of them. That just angers me that those people did that and said that. Verse 6, "Therefore, behold, I will hedge up your way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her that she can't find her way. She will follow after her lovers, but she won't overtake them, and she will seek them, but won't find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then that was better with me than now." Now, for the rest of the story of the northern house whore, here is how Yahweh handled that. 2 Kings 18:11. "The king of Assyria carried Israel away to Assyria, and put them in Hala, and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes." Kind of sounds like what America does when they import foreigners, doesn't it? You know, what do they call those cities of refuge? That's not what they call them, but you know what I'm talking about. "Because they didn't obey Yahweh their God's voice, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses the servant of Yahweh commanded, and would not hear it or do it." You know, we run into people like that. They don't want to hear it. You know, hey, you know, I'm reading a book by David Jeremiah. Ay, ay, ay. The false teachings, you know, that's in there. It's like I want to write to him an email and say, don't you, you're so close to understanding the truth of what you say, but I know that if I tell him that the Sabbath isn't Sunday, he's just going to kick back, because that's what they're not going to hear it. Clean, done, no muss, no fuss was that Assyrian exile. Cut and dried, just the way Samson went into the whore in Judges 16:1, is the same way Yahweh dealt with the northern house whore. Now, this effectively prevented any of the people from the northern house from returning back to the land of Israel. Returning back to the land without having a relationship with Yahweh would not only happen when Yeshua came, would only happen, I should say, when Yeshua came died, restored Israel, and then resurrected. Because he restored Israel upon his death and in the grave and through that whole process. Hosea 2:7 says, I will go and return to my first husband, for then was it better with me than now. This is kind of related to the prodigal son story. The same idea. But we know that a wife cannot return to her former husband after a divorce. There may be some technicalities about that, but I'm going to leave it lay there. The only way for her to return was through the blood of the Lamb, Yeshua, who she had committed adultery against. Because she went rogue, becoming wild branches, wild tribes, she had to be grafted back into the olive tree, which is Yeshua. So here's how Yahweh's hedge worked. He kept scattering the northern house further away from the land of Israel as he drove them in all directions because of the many wars in the Middle East and those which were against Israel. Now we read about those empires that would make wars over the course of several hundred years in the book of Daniel. And those wars prevented Israel. It was the hedge that prevented Israel from coming back from their migrations. So they migrated out of the Middle East because that was Yahweh's hedge to prevent their returning to his land. If you're not one of his, he's not going to have you in his land. That's another point that people need to understand. So all that said, you must understand that Yahweh always has a remnant who serve only him. Elijah, the prophet to the northern house, was told by Yahweh that there were 7,000 men besides himself who had not bowed the knee to Baal. We find that in 1 Kings 19:18. That remnant was exiled with the northern house because Yahweh had promised he would never leave or forsake Israel. Yeshua has been with his people wherever they were scattered. And this is true to this day. He was with the northern kingdom both before and after the cross. Why? Why would Yahweh continue to be with this whore who he had divorced? And so this is hard for some people to grasp, but it is because he had made the promise to Israel that he would never leave or forsake them. He said, we read it today in the Haftarah, where he said, I don't do this for your sake. I do this for the sake of my name. That's why he doesn't leave or forsake all of his people who are still sinning against him right now. Deuteronomy 36:1 says, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or scared of them. That's your enemies when you go into the land. For Yahweh your God himself is who goes with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you. Joshua 1:5 reiterates this. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you nor forsake you. Now this was a promise with which each individual tribe and each individual person could count on. His people can count on this promise to this day, at this late stage of history. With those who serve and bow only to him, he remains close. With those who defy him and worship other gods, Baal and Asherah and Ishtar, in their various religious ideologies, he remains distant, but he keeps calling them. Even though Yahweh said he would not leave or fail or forsake them. He did say he would punish them if they forsook him. So he's not going to leave them, but he's going to punish them. You can't get any worse punishment than to be divorced and exiled from Yahweh. But for his own name's sake, he is with his people wherever they go. Joshua 24:20 says, if you forsake Yahweh and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you evil and consume you after he has done you good. So by sending his remnant with the northern house into exile, that's one way that he maintained his presence with the northern house whore, is through this remnant. She would receive, though, the gift of redemption and salvation when Yeshua died to restore those tribes back to the commonwealth of Israel, as Paul calls it in Ephesians 2:12. Now, all of this information is required so that those who read this one verse, that's Judges 16:1, will understand just how far-reaching Samson's prophecies are. They will understand the double meanings and will know why this one verse pertains to two different eras. The one that Samson was in and the future one which went into exile. And sometimes just a few prophetic words have layer upon layer of meaning, and this is one of those times. So Samson will now return to being a type and shadow of Messiah Yeshua. I'm going to show you this. This is yet another layer of understanding in these three verses in which Yahweh has used a main character to symbolize different aspects of prophecy. Judges 16:2. The Gazites were told, Samson is here. They surrounded him and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city and were quiet all the night, saying, wait until morning light, then we will kill him. The Gazites received knowledge of where Samson, symbolizing Yeshua, was. Now he was still in the world with, this northern house whore. And that's Israel. That's where Samson was in the world with the whore, aka Israel. Why? Because it represents that Yeshua went into the world with his exiles and that Israel in his day was the world as well. The Jews called themselves Israel, but they were not Israel. They were the world also, with similar religious ideas that missed the kingdom's mark. John 1:10 said he was in the world and the world was made by him and the world knew him not. Yeshua was always in the world from the time of Adam, folks. He was in the world before he came to restore Israel and save the world. And then when he walked among the house of Judah, he was literally in the world because they were the world in the first century, except for his remnant, his sheep, who have always known his voice and followed him. So he was literally in the world, but not of it. But also, Yeshua is in the world through his people. That's why he sent exiles with the whores that were exiled from Israel. Matthew 5:14 says, you are the light of the world. A light that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Mark 16:15 said, go into all the world and preach the good news to the whole creation. Again, let's go back to the Gazites. They received knowledge of where Samson was. And in one of the double meanings of this Judges 16:2 prophecy, The Jewish leaders became knowledgeable of Yeshua's whereabouts on the night before that Passover on which he laid down his life for us. As with Samson, so with Yeshua. Now the scene jumps forward a little. It will give us details about Yeshua's crucifixion, when few have understood this throughout the eons. And I said earlier, if the Jews had understood Samson's story or Samson's prophecies in this chapter, they would have known that Samson prophesied of Yeshua. But Yahweh blinded them because they would not serve him. They worshipped everything but him. Judges 16:3 says, Samson lay until midnight and arose at midnight. Yeshua was taken into custody at about the middle of the night, mid of night, midnight. And he laid hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, and plucked them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of the mountain that is before Hebron. That's the top of the mountain is important, and I did not put it in this script. Through this, Yahweh delivered Samson from the whore, and he prophesied about Yeshua at the same time. So the scripture here does not say Yahweh's Spirit came on him, but you have to know that this kind of feat could only happen through Yahweh's strength. Now look at the posts and the bar of the gate. These three, the two posts and the bar, create an image of the doorways Israel came out of in Egypt at Passover, which have two posts and a lintel, a bar across the top. But also, do we not see Yeshua on the cross with those two posts? One upright, the other horizontal, from which he hung? Everybody thought Yeshua was weak, but in actuality, Yeshua was the strong man like Samson who carried these doorposts across on his shoulders. Samson went to freedom. Yeshua to his own crucifixion, his sacrifice that he made for us of his own free will. And by the way, let me now address the top of the mountain, because he was crucified on the Mount of Olives. There's a detail for you. Yahweh is clearly telling his people what's going to happen. If you'll come to me, I'll explain it to you, he said. Not to me, Kimberly, but to him. Come to me and I will tell you what my plans are. He says in Amos, I'm not going to do anything until I tell my prophets so that they can tell you. Samson was a prophet. Through the work of the Holy Spirit of Yahweh, Samson, symbolizing Israel when he escaped, because Israel escaped certain death, never to be able to return, because Yeshua on the cross, that's how Israel escaped that fate. Samson was delivered from the Philistines so he could give us this prophetic detail of how Israel would be delivered by Yahweh's master plan, which was made before the foundation of the world. This reminds me about the goat. Remember the goat who also escaped from year to year at Yom Kippur. So what was the master plan? The plan was for Yeshua to carry two posts and die thereon. This is how the northern house whore got the chance to be restored back to Israel. Her way was hedged up. She couldn't ever enter the land again. She would have to now be scattered worldwide, and she'd have to come back through Yeshua's blood. She could never come back any other way. Otherwise, she would have just come back and converted to Judaism, to their religious system. No, can't do that. That's not Yahweh's plan. The plan was the restoration of Israel. So after the cross, all who enter become Israelites because Israel was restored on the cross. Do you see how one passage can have many prophetic meanings within it? And who knew there was this much meat in just the first 3 verses of Judges 16? I didn't until Yahweh showed me. Now, the southern kingdom, along with Samson's prophecies and fate, will be left for next week. As you can see, we're already an hour in. I'm going to try not to have to go too long like this next week. I want to make it a little bit simpler and shorter. The point we must take away is that Yahweh has been telling us His plan through His prophets for thousands of years. And He has revealed more and more details of His plan to us the closer we get to the prophetic fulfillments of those prophecies. Now, some people may not care about these details, but we should. Why? Because every fulfilled prophecy is more strength for our faith. The more details we see in prophecy that have been fulfilled, the greater it will make our faith that Yahweh does keep His word. And that ends this teaching.